A retired welder in central Kansas turned an abandoned grain silo into a two-bedroom home for $14,500. Through 3 straight summers with outdoor temperatures hitting 104 degrees, he never installed an air conditioner. He never installed one because he never needed one. The inside of that silo sits in the low 70s on the worst day of August, and his cooling bill is exactly $0. He documented all of it. And when he went to get the structure legally recognized as a dwelling, the county planning office told him no. Not once. 4 times. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second. If you find stories like this interesting, the kind of story where a working solution exists and the paperwork refuses to acknowledge it, then subscribe to the channel right now. Because this channel exists to document exactly that. The building that outperforms the code. The design that solved the problem decades before anyone wrote a rule about it. The county file that quietly disappeared. We put a new one out every week, and the algorithm only shows them to people who have actually subscribed. So hit that button and let me know in the comments what state you're building in. Now let's get into what he actually built and why the answer is stranger than anybody expects. The silo he bought was a Butler brand, corrugated steel bin, 30 feet across, 24 feet tall at the eave, built sometime in the mid-1960s. He paid $900 for it. That price was not a mistake, and it was not a special deal. Across the American grain belt, there are tens of thousands of these bins standing empty on land that no longer needs them, and the farmer who owns the ground usually considers them a liability. They collect water. They attract rodents. They are a fall hazard for anybody willing to climb the ladder. Most farmers will let you take one for the cost of hauling it away. That is the first thing to understand about this story. The single most expensive part of building a house, the shell that keeps the weather out, is available across half of America for less than the price of a used refrigerator. The disassembly took 11 days. Corrugated steel bins are bolted, not welded, so they come apart the same way they went together. He numbered every sheet with a paint marker, stacked the panels on a flatbed trailer, and moved the whole structure 41 miles to his own 5 acres. The roof came off in wedge-shaped sections. Here is the full cost, and he kept every receipt. $900 for the bin, $2,200 for the concrete slab which he poured himself with a rented mixer and 2 neighbors, $1,400 for closed cell spray foam on the interior of the shell, $2,600 for framing lumber because the interior rooms are conventionally framed inside the steel envelope, which matters later, $1,900 for windows, all of them second-hand from a commercial demolition in Wichita, $800 for the wood stove and the flue, $2,100 for plumbing and fixtures, $1,600 for wiring and panel. Everything else, doors, paint, flooring, hardware, came to about $1,000. $14,500 and about 7 months of his own labor. Now the part that actually matters. The cooling. There is a reason grain silos exist in the shape they exist in, and it has nothing to do with looking good. A grain bin has one job, which is to keep several hundred tons of harvested crop from spoiling through a summer. Grain spoils when it gets warm and damp. So every design decision in a steel bin is aimed at a single outcome, which is moving heat out of the interior and keeping the internal temperature stable and low without spending money to do it. Start with the shape. A cylinder has the smallest possible surface area for the volume it encloses. Less surface area means less area for the sun to load heat into. A rectangular house with the same interior volume has roughly 15 to 20% more exterior skin absorbing sunlight all day. That difference alone is significant, and it costs nothing, because it is simply geometry. Then there is what happens to sunlight on a curve. On a flat wall facing west at 4 in the afternoon, the sun strikes nearly perpendicular, and almost all of that radiant energy is absorbed. On a cylinder, only a narrow vertical strip of the wall is ever perpendicular to the sun at any given moment. Everything to either side of that strip is hit at an increasingly oblique angle, and oblique light reflects rather than absorbs. The curve is constantly shedding the majority of the solar load that a flat wall would have to swallow. The heat gain on a round steel wall is a fraction of what the same square footage of flat wall would take on. Then there is the corrugation. Every one of those ridges casts a shadow into the valley beside it as the sun moves. That profile, which exists purely to add rigidity to thin steel, happens to also be a passive shading system across the entire surface of the building every hour of every day. But the real engine is the vertical stack. A grain bin is tall, narrow, and vented at the top. Hot air rises. In a 24-foot tall cylinder with a ridge vent or a roof cap and low intake vents near the base, you get what engineers call the stack effect, and the taller the column, the stronger the pull. Warm air exits at the peak, which creates negative pressure at the bottom, and that draws cooler air in through the low openings. This happens continuously with no fan and no moving parts. It happens harder on hot days because the temperature difference driving it is greater. The system self-regulates. The hotter it gets, the faster the building flushes itself. That is the whole trick, and it is not a trick at all. A grain bin is a chimney with walls, and the thing it was designed to exhaust was heat. The welder made 3 modifications, and all 3 were small. He opened the existing base aeration ports and screened them, which gave him low intake. He kept the original roof vent and added a second one. And he sprayed 2 inches of closed cell foam on the interior of the shell. But he stopped the foam 8 inches short of the roofline, leaving a continuous air gap between the insulation and the steel at the top. That gap turned the shell into a vented rain screen. Air enters at the base, travels up the inside face of the steel, picks up every bit of heat the sun puts into that metal, and exits at the peak before it ever reaches the living space. Interior temperature logged hourly across 3 summers with a cheap data logger. Highest recorded interior reading 78 degrees, during a stretch in July when the outside air hit 104 for 6 consecutive days. On a typical 95-degree afternoon, interior sets between 72 and 75. Nighttime, it drops into the 60s on its own. $0. Zero mechanical cooling. A building envelope that was designed in the 1960s for a completely different purpose, doing passive cooling better than most new construction does with a heat pump running. It is worth asking why there are so many of these standing empty in the first place, because the answer explains why this material is sitting there almost free, and why it will keep sitting there. Through the 1950s and 1960s, on-farm grain storage was a normal part of running a mid-sized operation. A family working 400 to 800 acres stored its own crop, held it through the winter, and sold when the price moved. That required bins on the property, so bins went up on nearly every farm in the belt. Manufacturers sold them by the tens of thousands. Then farms consolidated and grain handling centralized. Through the 1970s, land prices and borrowing climbed hard, and when interest rates spiked and commodity prices collapsed in the early 1980s, a great many family operations went under. The ground did not disappear. It was absorbed into larger operations, and those operations did not haul grain to a dozen scattered 30-foot bins. They built enormous facilities at central points, or sold straight into commercial elevators. What that left behind was a landscape full of structures with no remaining job. A 30-foot bin holds somewhere in the range of 8 to 10,000 bushels. A modern operation moves that much grain in an afternoon. The small bin became an obstacle to plow around and a liability the owner would rather not think about. There is no organized market for them because there is no demand. Scrap value, after you pay somebody to take one apart, is often close to nothing. So they stand. That is a very large quantity of engineered structural steel already built, sitting on the exact land where housing is hardest to build affordably. The other question worth answering is what happens in winter, because a building that cools itself for free raises an obvious concern about the other half of the year. The honest answer is that the same features that make it cool in August make it a challenge in January, and this is where the design actually requires thought rather than luck. That vented cavity that flushes heat out of the shell does not know what month it is. It keeps working. In summer, that is the entire point. In winter, it means the steel skin is cold and stays cold, and everything that keeps you warm has to happen on the inside of the foam. The welder handled it with 3 things. The foam layer itself, which is continuous and unbroken by studs, so there are none of the thermal bridges that leak heat through every framed wall in a conventional house. A small wood stove sitting near the center of the floor, which, in a cylinder, is a genuinely efficient arrangement, because every point of the perimeter is the same distance from the heat source, and there are no corners for cold air to pool in. and the concrete slab, which absorbs heat through the day and releases it slowly overnight. He also does something in November that takes about an hour. He closes and seals the low intake vents at the base, which shuts the stack down for the season, and reopens them in April. That single adjustment is the difference between a chimney and a sealed envelope, and it costs nothing. His heating cost is not zero. It is roughly 2 cords of wood a year, most of it cut off his own ground. But the point stands that a structure designed for grain storage in the mid-1960s handles both halves of a Kansas year with a wood stove and a hand-operated vent. So why won't counties approve it? The first denial came back in 11 days, and the stated reason was that the structure was not a permitted dwelling type under the adopted residential code. That sounds like a wall. It is not really a wall. It is a category problem, and the category problem is the entire story. Residential building codes in the United States are mostly some adopted version of the International Residential Code. That document is what is called a prescriptive code. A prescriptive code does not tell you what performance you have to achieve. It tells you exactly what to build. It says a wall assembly in this climate zone must have this insulation value framed at this spacing, with this fastener schedule, and this sheathing, and this vapor control layer on this side. It is a recipe book. And the enormous advantage of a recipe book is that a plans examiner with a 2-year certificate can look at a drawing and tell in 10 minutes whether it complies. That is not corruption. That is throughput. A county office reviewing 400 permits a year cannot afford to engineer each one from first principles. The problem is that a recipe book has no page for a thing that is not in the book. There is no chapter in the residential code for a repurposed agricultural steel cylinder. There is no prescribed wall assembly for corrugated galvanized panel with interior applied foam and a ventilated cavity. There is no fastener schedule for bolted bin sheets acting as a structural residential wall. The examiner is not saying this building is unsafe. The examiner is saying that this building is not in the book he is legally required to check things against, and he has no authority to invent a page. That is denial number 1, and it is honest. Denial number 2 was about engineering. The applicant was told that any structure outside prescriptive compliance requires stamped drawings from a licensed structural engineer demonstrating that the assembly meets or exceeds code intent for wind, snow, and seismic loading. This is the performance path. It exists. It is written into the code. Any building official in the country has the authority to approve a non-prescriptive design if a licensed professional certifies it. So he got an engineer. And this is where it gets uncomfortable because the engineer was willing and the analysis came back clean. Grain bins are engineered for loads that would flatten most houses. A loaded bin holds several hundred tons of grain, pressing outward against the shell at the base. The hoop stress a full bin generates is many times anything wind will ever do to it. The roof structures are rated for snow loads in the northern grain belt. Cylinders are the single best shape in existence for wind resistance, because there is no flat face for pressure to build against and no corner to create the low-pressure vortex that peels roofs off rectangular buildings. After every major tornado event in the Midwest, the photographs show the same thing. Frame houses gone, steel bins standing. The engineering stamp cost him $4,100, more than a quarter of the cost of the entire house. That is the real barrier in almost every one of these cases. The code technically allows it. The code just prices the permission at a level that erases the entire reason anyone wanted to do it. Denial number 3 was insulation. And this one is genuinely interesting because it reveals how the code thinks. The energy code specifies wall insulation by R value. In his climate zone, the requirement was R20 for above-grade walls. 2 inches of closed cell foam gives roughly R13. On paper, he failed. Except that R value is a measurement of resistance to conductive heat transfer through a static assembly. It says nothing about solar gain, nothing about geometry, nothing about ventilation, and nothing about thermal mass. It is a single number describing one of the several ways heat actually moves. His building was performing better than code minimum, measurably with data, while failing the metric the code uses to predict performance. He submitted 3 summers of hourly temperature logs. The response in writing was that the energy code has no provision for accepting measured performance data in place of prescribed assembly values. Read that one more time. He proved the outcome. The rule only accepts the method. There is a genuine reason behind that, and it deserves stating. Building officials cannot verify measured data. They cannot go sit in your house for 3 summers. They can look at a drawing and confirm that the wall has the specified insulation. The prescriptive system exists because it is enforceable at scale. A performance-based system requires a level of technical review that most county offices are not staffed to do. So the code chooses something it can actually check. But the consequence of that choice is that a building which works gets rejected, while a conventional house that leaks like a sieve gets stamped, because the stamp is checking the recipe rather than the result. Denial number 4 had nothing to do with the building at all. It was zoning. Zoning and building code are entirely different systems, and people conflate them constantly. Building code asks whether the structure is safe. Zoning asks whether that use is allowed on that ground. The parcel was zoned agricultural, and agricultural zoning in that county permitted farm structures and single-family dwellings. But it defined a dwelling by minimum square footage and required it to meet the residential code, which loops directly back to denial number 1. There is also a piece almost nobody talks about. Minimum dwelling size rules were widely adopted into rural zoning in the 1950s and 1960s, and the effect, and in many documented cases the intent, was to keep property values and tax bases up by excluding cheap housing. A 30-foot cylinder gives you about 700 square feet on the main floor. In a county with a 1,200 square foot minimum, the building is illegal on arithmetic alone, no matter how well it performs. Now here is the part that changes the shape of this whole story, and I want to be careful to be accurate about it. Silo homes do get approved regularly. There is a company in Missouri that has been converting grain bins into permitted dwellings for over a decade. There are approved bin homes in Texas, in Colorado, in Iowa, and Ontario. There is a well-documented cluster of them in the Ozarks. The approvals are real, the certificates of occupancy are real, and the buildings are insured and mortgaged. What separates the approved from the denied is almost never the building. It is the paperwork path. The projects that succeed do 3 things. They hire the structural engineer at the beginning instead of after the first denial, and budget $4,000 to $6,000 for it as a line item rather than treating it as an insult. They meet with the building official before they build anything, which turns the official from a gatekeeper into a collaborator and, critically, gets the objections identified, while changes are still cheap. And they design the interior as a conventional framed structure inside the steel shell, which means the plumbing, the wiring, the egress windows, the stair geometry, the smoke detection, and the room dimensions all comply with the ordinary code on their own terms. The steel becomes, in code language, a weather envelope over a compliant house. That last one is the actual key, and the Kansas welder had already done it without realizing why it mattered. His interior was conventionally framed. He just never presented it that way. He presented a silo. If he had presented a code-compliant 700 square foot dwelling that happens to be sheltered by an existing steel structure, the review would have been a different conversation entirely. Language decides outcomes in permitting far more than most people are prepared to accept. There is one more obstacle, and it is the one that stops more of these projects than any county ever has. Financing and insurance. Mortgage lending in the United States runs on comparable sales. An appraiser establishes value by finding similar properties that recently sold nearby. If there are no other silo homes within a reasonable radius, and there almost never are, the appraiser cannot produce a supported value. Without a supported value, there is no conventional loan. This is not hostility. It is that the entire apparatus of residential lending is built on the assumption that the property is ordinary. Insurance hits the same problem from a different direction. Underwriters price risk from actuarial tables, and there is no table for converted agricultural steel structures used as dwellings. Some carriers will write a custom policy at a premium. Many decline not because they assess the risk as high, but because they have not assessed it at all and declining is free. The practical result is that these builds are almost entirely cash projects on owned land, which limits who can do them, which keeps the comparable sales count near zero, which keeps financing closed. The loop feeds itself. So where does this actually land? The Kansas welder eventually got there. It took 19 months. He hired the engineer. He redrew the plans as a conventional dwelling within an existing agricultural structure. He added 2 egress windows he did not think he needed. upgraded to 3 inches of foam to satisfy the R value on paper even though the data said the 2 inches was already outperforming it, and applied for a zoning variance on the square footage minimum, which the board granted after a neighbor who was a retired county surveyor spoke in favor of it. Total additional cost, including the engineer, the variance filing, the extra foam, the windows, and permit fees, was $11,200, which means the house cost $14,500 to build and $25,700 to be allowed to live in. That number is the whole story compressed into one line. The construction was cheap, the permission was not. And nothing in that $11,000 made the building any cooler, any stronger, or any safer than it already was on the day he finished it. I want to be genuinely fair here because there is a version of this story that turns into a simple argument about bureaucrats, and that version is not true. Building codes exist because buildings used to kill people constantly. Fires that took entire city blocks, collapses, carbon monoxide, children falling from windows, electrical fires from ungrounded wiring. Nearly every line in the residential code is there because somebody died in a way that was preventable. The prescriptive approach exists because it is enforceable by a normal person in a normal office in a normal amount of time, and enforceability is what makes a safety rule real rather than decorative. The failure here is not that the code is too strict. The failure is that the code has almost no mechanism for accepting evidence. It can accept a licensed professional stamp at a price that excludes most owner builders, and beyond that, it accepts nothing. Not measurement, not 3 years of data, not the plain observable fact that the building is doing the thing the rule was written to make buildings do. There is movement. Appendix Q of the Residential Code, adopted in the 2019 cycle and expanded since, created real provisions for small dwellings, adjusting ceiling height, stair, and loft requirements that had previously made small homes impossible. That appendix exists because a decade of people building tiny houses illegally created enough pressure to change the document. Codes do respond. They respond slowly and they respond to volume, which means the number of people who apply matters more than the strength of any individual argument. If you are looking at an abandoned bin on land you own, the sequence that works is not complicated. Call the building department before you buy anything and ask what path exists for a non-prescriptive structure. Budget the engineer as a first cost, not a last resort. Design the interior to code on its own merits and let the steel be a shell. Check the zoning minimum square footage before anything else because that one is fatal and the cheapest thing to find out. And write your application in the language the reviewer is trained to read. The cooling is entirely free. It has been free since the day that bin was bolted together in the mid-1960s by engineers who were solving for grain and accidentally solved for people. 30 feet of curved steel, a vented cavity, and a 24-foot chimney of rising air. No compressor, no refrigerant, no utility bill in July. The physics were never the obstacle. The physics were finished before anyone was born. What stands between that building and a certificate of occupancy is a document that can verify a recipe and cannot read a result. And until that changes, the cheapest, genuinely comfortable house in America will keep being the one that nobody is allowed to call a house.